Hey guys, Chris here, and I'm a Ukrainian Canadian. Today is July 31st, 2023, and let's get to the news happening in Ukraine, shall we? Today is the very last day of July, and I thought it'd be really cool to visualize the Ukrainian liberation around the Velika Novosilka axis, as we often overlook the amount of work and amount of time it takes to liberate territory, especially in Zaporizhzhia. And I think it's good to visualize it. As you can see, the Ukrainian forces first start pushing on the outskirts of Neskuchne and Oktyabr, eventually taking some territory on the sides here. And then they did a big push in Neskuchne around the Mokre Yale Valley, as you can see here. They took back Neskuchne, Oktyabr, Makarivka, and they got awfully close to Staromayorske. Now, they challenged the Russians here, but the Russians pulled up a small counteroffensive and they were able to push back the Ukrainian forces. And so the Ukrainian army started liberating the flanks of Makarivka. As you can see, they slowly pushed here in Rivnopil, Novodarivka, pushing along Priutne as well. And eventually they got to Staromayorske, very close to the village, and they liberated the village as of last week. And now we can see that obviously by taking Staromayorske, the Russians will undoubtedly leave Urozhaine very soon in the foreseeable future, as they're directly being almost encircled west of Urozhaine by obviously the Ukrainians' presence in Staromayorske. So overall, the advancements are not fast, but we also need to understand that the Russians have had months, at the very least since fall of 2022, to build their defenses in Zaporizhzhia. And they had time to build those trenches, saturate these large farm fields with mines, and build their dragon's teeth. And they had time to consolidate a massive network of trenches in Zaporizhzhia, which makes the job extremely difficult, as the Ukrainians don't have all the promised weaponry that was supposed to come their way, as well as the jet fighters that they very much so need. So unfortunately, this is where we're going to be seeing in the foreseeable future, is just Ukrainians slowly pushing and degrading Russia's defenses little by little. So the next village will be Zaporizhzhia. So in the next few weeks, I guess the Ukrainians will continue pushing, and we should start seeing a liberation of Zaporizhzhia by the Mokre Yale Valley. The other thing I wanted to show you, and that's also positive, is there was a sense of concern as the Russians pushed about 100,000 soldiers in the north around the Svatove line, and they took a little bit of territory south of Svatove, as you can see here. But the good news is that the Ukrainians were able to push back these Russian gains, and they stabilized the line yet again. So this, as I've said in one of my videos last week, that this is obviously concerned that the Russians have such a large grouping of forces, but the Ukrainians are also very well prepared at defending this area. And so whatever territory the Russians might gain, it will be very small, and it won't really have an impact over the entire front line. So it's really good to see that the Ukrainians were able to liberate this small little parcel of territory, liberated back through small counteroffensive that they've conducted in the last few days. So overall, the front line here in the north seems to be the same. Crimean, Svatove, and north of Kupiansk remain largely the same. So nothing has really changed since my last video. So that's really positive. And again, the Ukrainians in Bakhmut continue pushing the Russians. They've taken back part of Klishivka and Andriivka. And it's a difficult fight because obviously the Russians also have about 50,000. That's a gross estimate. It's not the best estimate, but it's about 50,000 soldiers around the great Bakhmut area. So the Ukrainians, of course, are fighting a difficult battle here as well. And again, it's the same story around Velika Novosilka, Robotyne, around Orikhiv. The Ukrainians are very close within Robotyne, which is the very first line of defense that the Russians have built here. So we should start seeing some good positive movements and liberation in the next few weeks in August, as the Ukrainians, and I will show you my next slide, have hit the Chongar bridge in Crimea. So this is the bridge that connects Crimea to Kherson. And this Chongar railway bridge goes over the Savash Lagoon. So this is a very important connection for the Russians. They're using their trains to push their supplies to the front line here. And this is their weak link, is one of their weak links is the Chongar railway bridge. And so the Ukrainians have damaged it as of yesterday. And you can see there's a visual confirmation here. Now, the damage is not critical. It is severe, but it is not critical. However, such attacks continue to weaken the Russian efforts to resupply their troops in the south. So their forces still heavily rely on trains and its railway troops for military logistics. So even if it's a day or two of a pause where they can be driving these trains to Melitopol, Tokmak, Berdyansk, wherever, this can mean life or death for these Russian defenders fighting in Zaporizhzhia, who are already starving, most likely, starved out of ammunition. We've seen the complaints of them not being able to do counter battery fire and generals being dismissed because of this criticism. So this is really positive. And I think that every time Ukraine hits an important railway link, an important transportation hub, an ammunition depot, whether it be in Crimea, in Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, you can feel it as the Russians start losing some villages, some posadka, some farm fields. So we should start seeing some very good things in August. Now, I always like sometimes talking about political articles because they came out with another really good article about why the Ukrainian people see no sense in negotiating with Russia now. And you can see there's been an increase of Putin's minions complaining that Ukraine doesn't want to negotiate with us. We're ready, but Ukraine doesn't want to. Look how bad they are. They want total war. But there's a reason why Zelensky's administration, also the Ukrainian people, are not interested in negotiating with Russia anymore. And for them, a negotiation can only be done with Russia's complete collapse. So obviously, as it says here, according to the country's historical experience and the most recent ones, Budapest Memorandum and the Minsk agreements, if the Russian state exists in its current form, it will not engage in sincere negotiations or sign a peace deal in good faith. So they mentioned, an episode in 1992 where Russia sponsored the breakaway region of Transnistria and the kind of civil war that happened there, or the proxy war, I should say, that Russia sponsored in Moldova in 1992, which took place during a relatively pro-Western and liberal period of recent Russian history, when Putin was still a political nobody in St. Petersburg. And it illustrates a larger point. It really doesn't matter whether Putin is in power or not in the future, or whether the Russian regime is democratic, totalitarian, monarchic, oligarchic, or something else. Moscow's expansionist drive will likely persist. And we have to look at history. No matter whether it was Putin in power, whether it was, the Soviet Union, they've always had this expansionist drive. And history is a huge indicator of that. Furthermore, when it comes to Ukraine, Russia's aggressiveness is particularly virulent and uncompromising, as it refuses to recognize Ukrainian national identity and culture. And it's hard not to conclude this disrespect has its roots not only Muscovite arrogance, but is also part of the Russian feeling of inferiority. Kyiv was, after all, the historical capital of medieval Kievan Rus, 3 centuries before Moscow was even mentioned in the chronicles, which is absolutely true, right? Russia has an identity crisis because they can't really claim that, they're the original Kievan Rus, or they're the founding fathers of the Kievan Rus, when literally you have the name Kievan Rus. The capital was in Kiev. And so Kiev was the capital of the Slavic nations that we know as of today, Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. And so for them, that's the identity crisis, knowing that they don't control Kiev and they never will. And so they refuse to recognize Ukraine as kind of this creator of the great, different states that then, the branches of the Kievan Rus through Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. And there's nothing wrong with that. Russia can be its own country, but don't try to rewrite history and say that Kievan Rus was Russian and it's the Russians that, deserve all the rights for this. Given this historical mindset, short of a Ukrainian submission to Russians' demands, it's unclear what kind of lasting compromise with Moscow could be realistically achieved. Through truce may become desirable, now or later, strategic considerations advise Kyiv against trusting Moscow, as it would just use a pause to prepare its army, economy, and population for another future assault. Again, never trust Russian people and the Russian state again. As I've said with these two examples, the Budapest Memorandum and the recent Minsk agreements in 2014 and 2015 are all you need to understand that Russia will not sign treaties in good faith, and they will use any pause to allow themselves to have a breathing room so they can rearm themselves and continue their expansion, whether it be in Ukraine, in the Baltics, in Poland, Moldova, Georgia. They'll continue doing that. And so the morale of this article is that we need to get rid and destroy Russia's regime, its government, and massive reforms need to be imposed on the Russian people, whether they like it or not. Because if we want to have a stable world, that needs to happen. And so unfortunately, the bad thing about it is that the Russian society and Putin's regime is in it for the long run. They are okay with using as many men as possible, mobilizing as much as they want and as much as they can for their ambitions for this war. And so, as we've seen, the Russians have been okay to die for whatever reasons, for the great motherland of Russia, but they've been okay to die for Russia and Putin. So this is a reality that we need to accept. And for the last video, a little bit of positivity. So this video showcases basically the dismantling of the Soviet emblem on the Kyiv Motherland monument, which is a very prominent monument in Kyiv. You can see it from the Pecherska Valley. And so this statue is about 100 meters high. And so finally, the Soviet symbol is being removed from the statue. And this will be just in time. They will replace it with the Ukrainian trident from the Rurik dynasty by August 24th, which is the Ukrainian Independence Day. So I'm very happy to see this because this was one of the very last, Soviet monuments that existed in Ukraine, and it's one of the largest ones, the most prominent ones. And perhaps it's the superstitious part of me, but maybe by putting this trident, maybe this new monument will help the Ukrainians regain and liberate Ukraine in full very much quicker than expected. Now, that's just a superstitious part of me, but the Pecherska Valley is an extremely saint valley for the Ukrainians. There's a lot of monasteries there, a lot of churches, and this monument was kind of this yoke, with this Soviet symbol present there. So I think it's extremely important to remove it, and it's really good to see, the Ukrainian government putting the importance to get rid of this Soviet symbol. So that's the video for today, guys. Let me know what you think about my comments today, my analysis. I'm looking forward to make other videos in the future for you guys. And thank you for your support. I really appreciate your support for this channel. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you. Take care and see you next time.